Now, the focus of this paper is on a lot of issues that the three blue ribbon task forces don't take up, in which I think they need to. But I don't want to say that they don't have a lot of good ideas. They've come up with several very good things. The transition to higher levels of educated and skilled immigrants seems to me very sensible. The idea that immigration into the American national community, and I would add emotional attachment, is very important, seems to me like a very good idea. All of those things are, I think, advantages that we should say thank you to them for. But the three task forces begin with the premise that you have to exchange legalization for enforcement, and that's where things start to go wrong. This is from the Duke report, but it's not the only indication of this, and I'd like to read it if I may. Their report says, even if sending 12 million people home were feasible, it would be a catastrophic choice, enormously expensive, diplomatically disastrous, and hugely costly in human terms. Neighborhoods would be torn apart, families would be separated, and a new sorry chapter written in American race relations. Less draconian measures enforced by immigration officials at all levels of government to encourage illegal immigrants to leave on their own was examined by our roundtable, and none would pass muster. A lovely phrase. But if you look and you ask yourself, well, why wouldn't they pass muster? There's actually no explanation. It simply said they wouldn't pass muster. And some of us, this is the panel talking again, not ours, theirs. Attrition through enforcement was offensive to our values. Now, what values would they be? Would it be the values of enforcement? Because there's a paradox here. If you're trading legalization for enforcement, the enforcement part of it is exactly what's behind the attrition idea. So if you're in favor of attrition, workplace enforcement, it'll lead to attrition, and you're saying, well, that's bad unless you couple it with legalization. The logic really doesn't hold. And here's my next favorite on that, which is that others thought, and this is in their report, others thought that because such a strategy would not likely to be rigorously or consistently implemented, it would therefore be ineffective. So catch the logic of this. If you have enforcement strategies, they won't be effectively implemented. Therefore, we shouldn't have enforcement strategies, but we need an enforcement strategy in order to make the trade to get the 10 to 12 million illegal immigrants. I'm sorry, it didn't make much sense to me. Well, these quotes lay out the stark differences between deportation and attrition. Now, the deportation idea can generally be thought of as you round them up and you ship them home. And the critics say that it's draconian, impossible to enforce, and would do damage to American interests. And I think they are absolutely right. I think it would. I would add to that, can you imagine the scenes of, police officers coming in and tearing people away from each other? They would be highly televised, and believe me, you would see a lot of them. And frankly, emotionally and politically, America could not sustain such a strategy. But you don't need to have that deportation strategy. What you need to have is the linchpin, which the Jordan Commission talked about, which is workplace enforcement. Now, workplace enforcement is something that every commission member, thinks of is very important. But the idea of workplace enforcement, and they all want to have E-Verify, and they all want to have biometric cards, and they all want to make sure that, nobody could get a job who shouldn't, and that is something that sounds very strong. The only problem is that E-Verify is not very far along in being the kind of system that we can depend on. I go through in the paper a number of studies that have shown, including one by the people who developed it, that they really only can catch people who shouldn't be there half the time. And that's not a good record. The idea, it's now voluntary. There are no penalties involved, and even if you made it mandatory, you would have to get up to speed over a couple of years for millions and millions of job applicants who would have to be checked. And I simply don't have confidence that that can be done. So what's the problem with that? Well, the bottom line of the problem of this is what I call asymmetric gains, which is that in any grand bargain, you have two sides of an issue, and they don't necessarily like the premises of the other side, and they don't necessarily accept the other side. But each side is willing to accept the other's existence to go ahead and get some kind of resolution of the issue. But the asymmetry of this is precisely that legalization happens with a stroke of the pen, and people who are legalized have their status changed for the better immediately, as it happens, whereas the people who want to have stronger enforcement must await the day when enforcement verification procedures are up to the burden that are being placed on their shoulders. So it's legalization now versus enforcement down the road sometime in the distance, which may or may not happen. And it seems to me an unfair advantage in the grand bargain calculation. Now, why is that important, you might ask? Well, the issues of fairness and issues of reciprocity and the basic premises underlying such a grand bargain strategy, but there's another reason down the road, and that is that America continues to be the destination of preference for tens and tens of millions of immigrants, possible immigrants from all over the country. And I quote a number of resources in my paper, and let me just give you one. The Pew Foundation, which is, a center, reputable place, suggested that for one country, Mexico, about 33% of over 23 million, or about of the 71 million persons of immigration age in Mexico, say they would like to live in the United States. And of those, nearly 13 million say that they would do it even if they weren't legalized. And so that's just one country. If you take that from all over the world, the number of people who would like to come here, even having a grand bargain now is not going to be able to shut off the hopes of people who want to come here and their determination to do that. And all of the blue ribbon panels are in agreement that immigration amnesties are magnets for future expectations. And it stands to reason. If it happened before, and then it happens again, and yet it happens again, a reasonable expectation is that if you wait around long enough and you can get into the country, that somewhere down the road people will say, well, we have all these people living in the shadows, we have to do something about them. Now, I mentioned that they don't take on the three blue ribbon panels do not take on the question of how many immigrants we really ought to have, which is a question of our resources and our ability to do with them. The Duke report, as I mentioned, has 1.1 million. The MPI says 1.5 million. Some of the reformers want to have all the workers and their dependents come over. Others leave that sort of iffy. The MPI report changes the calculation of family preferences and educated workers so that the percentages are changed, but the actual numbers of people coming in under the family preferences are exactly the same, about 620,000 a year in estimates. And so that raises the question, well, how is it possible to change the percentage and still get the exact numbers of immigrants coming in that you had before, whereas this was the idea of reform? And the answer to the question is a simple word: addition. You add categories and preferences until you get the numbers that you want to reach that make the immigration numbers that you want to have. So whether it's by not reforming the family preference categories or by adding new levels of skilled workers and their families while keeping the number of non-skilled workers the same, each of the task forces, each in their own way, solves the problem of illegal immigration by issuing more green cards. Now, this seems to me somewhat analogous to decreasing the number of bank robberies by simply telling your tellers to give out more money every time people ask for it. It's, in a sense, making the category of illegal immigration a null category because you'll be giving out enough visas so that there'll always be enough spaces in the visa line for people. Let me turn quickly. How am I doing on time there, Mark? Okay. You know, obviously, I'm an analyst and a political scientist, not an economist, but I do know one thing about economics. When a desirable object is available and subsidized, you increase the demand for it. And my point was before that America is a desirable commodity. People want to come here, and they're going to keep trying to do that. Personally, I think that's generally a plus, and we should encourage that. But